Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today for the launch and presentation of the Centre on Regulation in Europe, or CERRE's, new paper exploring new ways of oversight for the digital economy. I'm Laura Natale, CERRE's Tech, Media, Telecom and Mobility Director. We are the independent Brussels-based think tank advancing top quality regulation practices in the network and infrastructure industries. We draw perspectives from our community spanning academia, regulatory authorities and industry. I'll be facilitating today's session, which I've been really looking forward to, as we have the authors of the new paper just trailed here to present it to us. And that's Michèle from CRIDS Research Centre at the University of Namur, and Alexandre de Streel, also from the University of Namur, where he's Professor of EU Law and, of course, CERRE Academic Co-Director. This paper is a piece of work that here at CERRE we really see as kicking off a much broader reflection and long-term vision of oversight of digital regulation and the digital economy, because we know that oversight is a key component of successful regulation. And we're at a point in time where governments around the world are seeking to regulate digital platforms, and these efforts make the headlines. And the EU is already some way along this journey. I believe it's been over 6 years since the digital single market was conceived. But now, even with the most balanced and consensually agreed upon regulatory frameworks under conception or in place, their successes can be undermined by a lack of effective oversight. With that in mind, Michèle and Alex have looked into how public authorities can oversee the application of the rules by digital platforms and encourage the emergence of what we're calling an ecosystem of oversight, looking at cooperative relationships between oversight bodies, the platforms, and their users to achieve public interest objectives. To date, there is little EU legislation detailing the oversight mechanisms of the rules applicable to platforms. But the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, recently adopted proposals by the Commission, are landmark proposals as they both deal with some novel regulatory issues and may therefore bring with them changes in the supervision of the platform economy within the EU, which we also foresee as having impact beyond the EU. When it comes to the businesses involved, we need to consider global reach, sometimes information asymmetry, certainly complex business models, and also how existing rights, and particularly fundamental rights, might come into play. So with this in mind, CERRE is aware of the need to kickstart reflection around the culture and continuum of oversight and the new ways in which these need to be applied. To trail now then that after Michèle and Alexandre have presented their papers, we've convened a great panel of speakers in the multidisciplinary tradition of CERRE. So we have the French regulatory body Arcep, we have the Bavarian Authority for New Media, and their representative who also sits on the Council of Europe Platform of Authorities, EPRA. We have a leading researcher in the field from the University of Utrecht and Facebook, and I'll introduce all these representatives when we open the panel in a while. As always, our CERRE public webinars are collaborative sessions based around mutual learning. So we welcome your questions via Slido using the hashtag CERREDigital or scanning the QR code that is on screen, and I will put questions to speakers throughout the session. Lastly, we also warmly encourage you to sign up to the CERRE newsletter. You'll find details in the box below if you're following on YouTube or on the CERRE website, cerre.eu. Now, let's get on to the substance of this session. Michèle, Alex, producing this paper has been a very interesting journey. I've had the pleasure to observe with you how your reflections have evolved as you've looked at, in a methodological way as well, how public authorities can oversee the applications of rules, what models might be worth considering. And I wanted to take this opportunity to congratulate you actually as we publish the paper today on what I think is a very crisp and thought-provoking piece of work. I know you have some slides prepared, so over to you for your presentation. Michèle and Alex, you have the floor.
So yes, thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction. Yeah, as you said, it's really timely to look at this question because, as we all know now, many governments around the world are looking at how to design new rules. And of course, the question that's not so often looked at is how to oversee the application of these new rules. So it's a really key question because even if you have really good rules in place, if you don't oversee the application of the rules, then you could even undermine or discredit public intervention. So if we move to the first slide, the paper that Alexandre and I are really delighted to present to you today is about how public authorities will be able to oversee the application of rules by platforms. Now, we're not only talking about the big, huge platforms that we all know, but also about the small and very small platforms. And the objective, as Laura has said, is really to stimulate debate and discussion. This is the start of the process. It's not an easy thing. And we're really eager to hear your views about the ideas that are put forward in the paper, and to gather more ideas about how we could do things. So just to frame a little bit more the scope of the paper, we've decided to exclude a number of things because it would be so huge. We've decided to exclude the content of the rules. I mean, we're not going to discuss today about what the rules should look like as in substance. We're not going to discuss either about, we don't particularly want to focus this paper on the enforcement of the rules per se, because that's focusing very much on what happens when things go wrong. Whereas oversight is more to do with how do you ensure that things actually are going to work well in practice, and how are we going to ensure that the platforms comply with the rules. Another question which is really interesting, but we've decided not to cover today, is more the institutional side of things. Who is competent to oversee the application of these rules, and how can mechanisms be put in place to ensure cooperation between the various authorities that would have a role to play. So those are really interesting institutional questions, but that we've decided, rightly or wrongly, to exclude from this paper because it's a whole subject in itself. So as you rightly said, of course, all this comes at a time when the DSA and the DMA have just been proposed by the European Commission. Also, we've addressed some of the new oversight mechanisms that have been put forward in these two pieces of legislation, but we've not focused it incredibly on that. So what we propose to do is at the end that Alexandre gives us his insights about how some of the ideas that we put forward in the paper are mapped in the proposals. So if we go to the next slide, as you also mentioned, Lara, the challenges are actually quite enormous because the platform economy is very, very different to what we're traditionally used to regulate. Here we have a huge number of platforms to regulate. Sometimes they're enormous platforms, sometimes they're very small platforms as well. The European Commission quoted that there are more than 10,000 platforms in Europe that are operating at the moment, and 90% of those are operated by small and medium enterprises and startups. So, you know, let's not forget them either. Now, there's a large amount of information asymmetry between the platforms and the oversight authorities. We all know that platforms hold, you know, quite a lot of data, which isn't necessarily in the hands of the oversight authorities. There's a huge amount of complexity in some of the business models that are developed by the platforms. Just think of the advertising market, how complex that is. And there's a huge amount of innovation as well in the developments that we see. So there's also, it's a huge issue because platforms have such an impact on society and on fundamental rights. We all know that there's freedom of expression that's involved. And you know, big questions about pluralism, you know, other topics. So it's, you know, it's got a huge impact on society as well. Now, what makes things really challenging as well is perhaps that at the moment there isn't that much in the EU regulatory framework on oversight. What we do see is we have some elements that are contained in more sector-specific directives or pieces of legislation, and that organize the setup of certain regulatory authorities in certain sectors, giving them certain powers, but a lot of it is not regulated. And for sure, at the moment, what we see is that all this area that we're talking about at the moment is largely non-supervised, non-regulated, except again for certain specific areas such as data protection. So we've put here on the slide the picture of the Everest, but we could have put Mars or anything else. So it's a bit like climbing the Everest, and you know, it would be I think it's completely true that we can't think as if we're regulating the traditional broadcasting or telecom sector. This is something completely different. And therefore, we need a completely different way of new method of oversight. It seems pretty logical, and that's why we've come up with this. Well, it's not our idea, but we propose this new ecosystem of oversight. So that we'll explain in a minute. But before we get to that, if we turn to the next slide. It obviously all starts with the law that we are actually in Europe about to adopt at the moment, in the form of the DSA and the DMA. And there are key questions, of course, to be addressed. Also in terms of, should the law be principle-based or should it be more detailed? And that has an impact as well on the oversight models that we're going to be developing, because a more general principle-based legal framework is, of course, probably more adapted to the digital economy, because, as we know, everything moves so quickly. It's probably better to have something that's more principle-based. But therefore, the task of the oversight authority will be bigger, because they will actually be going to have to be detailing the rules. So they've got to be well equipped to be able to do that. On the other side, if we develop detailed rules, probably the oversight in a way will be simpler for the oversight bodies, but it might not be as adapted to change, basically. So once of course, the law has also got to set the principles for having a good regulator, a good oversight mechanism, and for having good oversight principles. So a good regulator, I mean, that's not a new question. It's a question that we've been struggling for, you know, in certain sectors for years and years. It's to do with having an independent regulator, and we all know that's still a struggle to achieve in some areas, and independence from the stakeholders, but also from the governments. Correct rules on accountability. They've got to be correctly funded, staffed, resources, especially, you know, to deal with these new issues that the data economy, and they've got to have adequate powers of sanction and investigation. We're not focusing too much on that because those are, if you want, the givens that of course we would like to have, but it's far from clear that we've got them yet, especially when we look at the oversight of platforms. Because as well, maybe what I didn't say before is that you know, the platform economy is at the moment, you know, not regulated, and often is in the regulation, the oversight that there is in the hands of ministries in some countries, not necessarily regulators. And then there's the principles of good oversight. And here we've put forward a number of principles that I've put here on the slide. I'm not going to run through every single one of them, but just to pick out some of them. Obviously, the regulator has got to be bound by a principle, say, of proportionality. So it's the idea that you can't expect the regulator to oversee the application of the rules in relation to all platforms in the same manner. He's obviously going to have to focus on the ones you know, where there's more of a risk to society, and so it's a risk based enforcement principle that we propose. Openness is extremely important because it's linked to this ecosystem of oversight that we're going to discuss in a minute. Openness towards everybody, towards the platforms, towards society in general, towards users, towards academia. I mean, it's obvious it's got to function in the most open and transparent manner to be able to carry out its tasks sufficiently well. The respect of due process and respect to fundamental rights, that's also something that's fundamentally important, because you know, any action that the regulator would take has got to balance out various rights, the rights of the platforms to conduct their own businesses, but also the rights of individuals to privacy, to freedom of expression, etc. They've got to balance out all those rights in the decision-making process, and have got to allow for, you know, all the parties to be heard, and to have you know, proper appeal processes in place if they disagree with a decision of the regulator. Innovation friendly, they should really like as well, we think, the startups and the innovators, and not shy away from enabling them to develop new services. And there, of course, we can think about the regulatory sandboxes, you know, give them sandboxes to develop their new services, and help them to develop, without imposing necessarily all the full burden of regulatory obligations on them. Experimental, meaning that, you know, instead of going full-fledged suddenly with a solution, the regulator could do a trial and error assessment and start with something. Perhaps it's not going to work, take it back, and then, you know, backwards and forwards, experimental. And that leads us on to this idea that perhaps we could imagine that a regulator would be bound by some sort of a duty of care, benevolence, or, you know, be kind to others, you know, try and you know, foster what's needed. A bit like we're asking some of the, you know, the platforms, this duty of care is also something that we're asking platforms to do. You know, why not push it and into the public sphere as well? So those are some of the ideas, the sort of basics that are needed, we think, to pursue things. So if we turn to the next slide, this is where we come in with this. It's not a new idea. It's an idea that we've seen, especially in France, where the regulators in various sectors have come together and have put forward this idea as well, towards an ecosystem of oversight, where the regulator is there represented a bit as the conductor, the music conductor, the chef d'orchestre. And he has got to arbitrate and bring together, if you want, the enforcement of the rules, but that would be done collaboratively by the platforms and by the users. And so the idea there is that he would not be the only one in charge of overseeing the application of rules. It would be something that would be drawn in by others as well. So here we've put forward a number of proposals about, and some of these are directly inspired as well by what we see in the DMA, DSA. Some of them are inspired by what we see from, other regulators are doing in other sectors. So of course, the regulator is in the driving seat. It's not as if he's not going to do anything. I think one of the first and most important tasks is to provide guidance to everybody, to provide general guidance to the sector, what is expected from you, because we have now got this new piece of legislation. How are we going to oversee the application of these rules? But then also maybe moving towards really individual guidance, not leaving the platforms to fend completely for themselves, but having the possibility for them to submit, certain things to the regulator to see if they would be, okayed by the regulator. And I'm thinking maybe here in terms of some of the terms and conditions of platforms. We're asking platforms to do a lot through their terms and conditions. Please specify in your terms and conditions X, Y, and Z. Well, why not enable them, those platforms to say, okay, these are my terms and conditions. What do you think of them? Do you think they will be in line with the law? And then think of it as well of these small startups. We want to develop something. Well, what do we need to do? And they could provide guidance and solutions, or regulatory sandboxes, whatever. And then the part on of course, platforms have got a huge role to play as well, to ensure that they themselves are complying with the rules. But there are tools as well, like risk assessments that could be carried out by platforms. You self-assess yourselves the risk that your services entail for the users, and tell us what you think, and then getting a solution in light of these risk assessments. Compliance officers, that's also a really good idea, I think. So that they would be the people responsible, first of all, the contact point to the regulator, which is important as well, but also the ones that would have to disseminate within the company, what the rules should be. That's also a very, very interesting development. And then when you think about the users, of course, you can ask users to do a lot as well. But of course, before you can ask them to become really proactive and to say what they want, an important bit is to empower the users, to give them the right tools, the right information through digital literacy, for example, about what's right and what's wrong. And we've highlighted a number of examples in the report especially about contract terms, and also about comparing terms that were adopted a few years ago with the ones that are now, and there's a number of tools that you can develop that would empower users. So that's a really important part as well, I think. And then of course not shying away from the fact that you could be calling in independent auditors or trustees to help the regulator, to help the platforms to ensure compliance. I mean, they could be analyzing data, but they could also be overseeing how how platforms are conducting, say, risk assessments, or how they are, you know, how they're doing with their transparency reports, what's got to be included in the transparency reports. So there's a number of things that we can also ask the outsiders to do as well. So yeah, that's the one of the main ideas of the report. Maybe I let Alexandre continue now on if he wants to add something on this ecosystem of oversight, and then moving on to the technological oversight side of the paper.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So next to that idea of that the regulator should really be the orchestrator of a new ecosystem of oversight, the other idea that we have, and which is in the next slide, is that regulator could also be helped by digital technology. Okay, and digital technology is a huge opportunity for all of us, but also for the regulators. Now, that means what? That means first, I mean, technology is an opportunity to improve the operation of the regulator, but this is also what the regulator will have to oversight. And so we think that first, that means that the regulatory authority should have extensive power to inspect database and algorithm. And this is also, you see those kind of new power emerging in some national law, or they are also proposed in the DMA, in the DSA. So that's very good. But that's only the beginning, you know, because you may have an access to a lot of data, but then not to do what you have to do. And so it's a bit like us, you know, we receive a lot of term and condition, but then we don't read it. So the next thing is, of course, that the regulatory authority has the capabilities, and by that I mean the human capabilities and the technological capabilities to process all those data. Now, we are quite encouraged to see that in many national authorities now in Europe and beyond, there is more and more, you know, unit of AI specialists or data specialists, and we have some with us today, and that is really a good indication that we are moving in the right direction. And we give several examples in the paper. And then the last step. So you have to have the power to investigate the human capabilities, but also the technological capabilities. And there we think that AI could be a tool to help the regulator to do their own job. And so they should develop their own AI algorithm to do their job. I mean, this is what you see in particular for a financial regulator. Thibault is working on a very interesting project for antitrust regulator. So and this is also, I mean, things which are starting, but which are extremely interesting. No, that's if you still need a regulatory authority. The more radical step is you bypass completely the authorities, and you in a way insert the law and the rules directly in the computer code. You know, this is not a new idea. I mean, this is an idea which has been popularized already 20 years ago by Lawrence Lessig, which says, which wrote that we maybe should move from the East Coast, from the capital, to the West Coast, to the Silicon Valley. Now, this is something now that you see in some European law. You have this provision of privacy by design in the GDPR, and some are calling for consumer protection by design, antitrust by design, and all those kind of things. So there is, of course, a fashion there, but there is also probably some interesting element to think of. But also to safeguard to think of. Of course, not every law is can be coded, you know, because in a way, I could say when I discussed with my computer science friend, I said that lawyers tends to be more subtle than a computer scientist. No, of course, that's not true, but the law tends to be more gray than some computer code. So, of course, not every law can be coded. And also, and that's a very important legitimacy issue, the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast, and that some are elect, others are not. Okay? And that is, of course, a big issue. So now, and to finish, if we can go to the next slides, how the recent DSA and DMA proposal score according to our, let's say, recommendation. So let's go step by step. If you remember the principle of good regulator that that Michèle mentioned before. Possibly the DMA and the DSA score relatively well, but there is this issue of independence, which is absolutely key. It is important that national regulatory authority are independent and well funded and have those kind of technological capabilities that are needed. As I said, we were encouraged by some interesting initiatives, but there still remain some initiative, and it's not generalized. That's for the DSA. For the DMA, as we know, the Commission will have nearly the sole role to oversight and enforce those rules. Now, the problem is that the Commission is not necessarily independent from the European political power, you know. And in fact, if you listen to the speeches of the President of the Commission, she always say we want to have a more geopolitical Commission. So there is clearly there a tension between a requirement of independence and a willingness to become more political. Now, regarding oversight principle, where we think some improvement could be done, again, I mean, the proposal scored relatively well, but maybe some an innovation clause or some sandboxing possibilities in the DSA could be explicitly provided. Now, interestingly, we have, and we mentioned that in the paper, other law, for instance, the recent new law on automated vehicle, the new law on car in general, provide a specific innovation clause for self-driving car. Maybe we should have the same kind of things there. And on the DMA, clearly we will not get it right. I mean, the Commission will not get it right the first time, and so clearly some experimentation will be needed. You know, if you look at, for instance, the Google cases, clearly we may discuss about the theory of harm, whether they were right or they were wrong, but clearly I think we may all agree, or many people will agree, that the remedy have not been very effective so far. And so clearly there, it shows that it's very difficult. You know, I don't want to blame the Commission by saying that, but it's very difficult. I mean, the regulator will make mistakes. That's absolutely normal. The important thing is to recognize the mistakes and then to improve from that. Now, regarding this idea of an ecosystem of oversight, that's where probably the DSA scored relatively well, because indeed several actors are involved: national regulatory authorities, the Commission, the platform themselves, some external researchers, and so on. While that's where we think that the DMA do not score very well, because, you know, the DMA is very much organized around a dialogue, a regulatory dialogue between the Commission as the regulator and the platform, but all the other actors, for instance, the business user, the end user, the researchers, and so on, are not really present, or at least not explicitly present in the text. So clearly there is some improvement to be done. And regarding the use of technology to improve oversight, this is of course an issue of practice. And so we will see. The good point is that the DSA and the DMA provide new investigation power regarding data and algorithms, but the point is how it will be used. So, you know, to summarize, I think the two ideas that we want to convey in our report is, first, that the regulatory authority have a lot to learn from the platform they will oversee. Okay, so clearly, and to be a bit provocative here, maybe a regulator should behave like a digital platform, in the sense that they should orchestrate something. This is what has made the success of the platform, and they should use AI to improve their operation. Now, this probably will need a big change of culture. I know. In the book of Sébastien Soriano, the previous boss of Arcep, he explained that very well. He has a very, very good book in French. I hope it will be published soon in English. And on that, not only on that, but partly on that. And this is requiring a change of culture. Clearly, I mean, culture is more difficult to change than to adopt a new law. So yes, it will be difficult to adopt the DSA and the DMA, but I think it will be even more difficult to change the culture of the regulator. And the second message talking about adopting new law is that we think that the DMA has a lot to learn from the DSA. In a way, we think that the DSA score much better in terms of a good oversight than the DMA, which is a more, you know, a traditional two-way communication. And it doesn't really encapsulate this idea of an ecosystem. And we hope that the Council and the Parliament could improve the text in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I thought it was really rich and jam-packed with ideas. I'm hoping that will motivate many of our viewers today to read the paper in full too. Thank you so much, Michèle and Alex. I've definitely, even beyond my key learnings of the paper, I think with your presentations, there are some key ideas that stand out there. I thought personally it was very interesting, Michèle, your take on how principle-based oversight makes the task of the regulatory authority a lot bigger than, say, detailed rules, which make the job of the regulator simpler, perhaps. You know, we talked about openness and transparency, experimentation in oversight, which is an idea CERRE academics have been exploring throughout many of their research, and of course this be kind to others idea, which is a nice note to explore further in our panel. So we, as CERRE, we very much welcome feedback from viewers ongoingly on the vision that's been outlined just now. With that in mind, the Slido remains open for questions under the hashtag CERREDigital. Please let us know who you are and if you're addressing your question to any of our invitees here in particular. So with that in mind, it's time to introduce our panelists for their input on what we've just heard. This is a great group, I believe, who've really individually done a lot of thinking on these issues, so we're very lucky to have you all here today. First of all, Thibaut Schreppel, who Alex referred to once or twice in his comments. Thibaut is assistant professor at the Utrecht University School of Law. We have Johanna E, who is Senior Vice Chairperson at the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, also known as EPRA. It's a Council of Europe network, and is also European representative at the Bavarian Regulatory Authority for New Media. We welcome as well Pierre Dubreuil, head of the Data-Driven Regulation Unit for the French national regulatory body Arcep, which again was referred to in our comments just now, and Marisa Jimenez, Director of Public Policy and Deputy Head of EU Affairs for Facebook. Very warm welcome to you all. It would be great to start this round of reflections with your general reactions to the presentation you've just heard and to the full CERRE paper published today. Johanna, let's start with you. You're here today both representing EPRA and the Bavarian Authority. I think the EPRA network, bringing together regulatory authorities from across many countries, has also published thinking, I believe, in 2020 on how regulators and regulation adapt to changing circumstances, and that's surely a very cogent as we live through a global pandemic. So it would be, let's kick off with your top line views on the CERRE paper. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you to CERRE for inviting me. I'm really honored to attend this session. And I have to say, I'm absolutely overwhelmed by what's been presented by Michèle and Alexandre. And EPRA, to just quickly explain, is a little bit like CERRE in that it is a self-funded and totally independent think tank of regulators that has been around since 1995, now has 54 members from 47 countries covering roughly the area of the Council of Europe. And we are self-funded, independent, and we are just a forum for informal discussion on best practices, on views, on media regulation, and we share experiences and try to learn from each other. And trying to learn from each other always works to the degree that the learnings that you take with you after an exchange are then adaptable to your own social, historical, legal, and regulatory environment. That is something that is one of the big questions listening to your presentation came to my mind. If the oversight is to work across an industry, across an audience, across citizens, across businesses that act at least Europe-wide, if not globally, then in my view, it would require as uniform and as a global, at least on a European level, framework as possible. I've been working for my own regulatory authority in Bavaria for well over 30 years. And in that time, what I've seen, especially in a German legal and social framework where you have a division of powers between the federal government and the states as well, that means there is a special inertia in getting things changed. That is a process in, even if your thinking advances very quickly, it does take time. And that is one of the key issues that I've been wondering about. Speed of developments, especially in the digital economy and industry, is such that you always lag behind with legislation and regulation. And but I fully agree with Alexandre, who said it. There is a definite need for a change of culture, and that requires that you have to develop a new mindset on which you approach things. I believe I would like to leave it at that. I could pick up a lot of individual points, which I may come back to later, but that is my general first impression. And I would like to finish that with a great thanks, because it's really, really very informative, and it promotes thinking in a very good way.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It's very interesting to hear about that inertia versus need for change as well. And we follow EPRA's work with the blue skies thinking you're doing. It's an important forum that we appreciate very much. Thank you. Pierre, let's come to you. Arcep has trailed, is very active in this space. Has put forward some views, as Michèle mentioned, and also we perhaps shouldn't forget that France looks set with its presidency of the Council next year to oversee some crucial negotiations which will address oversight in 2022. So thank you as well for joining us today. Also, the name of your unit, Data-Driven Regulation, is very interesting for this discussion. So, so how have you received the paper? It would be great to hear more from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation at CERRE. And yeah, I lead the data-driven regulation. I will maybe come later to what we exactly do, but it's true that we have a lot of things in common with some of the part of the paper. So in my concern, this paper, new ways of oversight for the digital economy, I think it's a great contribution on the debate about digital platform regulation. Maybe 3 points. The first one is that it sets out what is a good ex-ante framework, and setting global general rules which are outcome-based and merely sets goals. In French, we have 2 words for different realities that have the same translation in English, regulation, and they should not be confused, I think. Réglementation is about setting rules and sanctioning the one that violates this rule. And regulation is about setting up a flexible framework in which the regulator can construct tailor-made decision and change them if they don't work. And I mean, I think that what we have in common with the paper is this. We think that the second one we consider as a good ex-ante framework. So that's a point that I really liked in this paper. The second point is maybe that the paper outlines the need to consider an ecosystem around the regulatory body. This idea is very important already for non-framework, such as the telco one. We can come with example later, but it's even more important from frameworks that are being designed, the DMA, for example, where the regulated actors are new to the oversight bodies. So considering a large ecosystem where and designing a framework where business users, but also potential competitors, I think, consumer associations and civil society representatives can shape guidance in dialogue with the regulator will help reduce the asymmetry of information that exists at the beginning of the framework. In telecommunication, we could almost say that it's easier because all the actors are physically interconnected in between them. So if one breaches a legal obligation, maybe another will come and can see it. But in the digital economy, it is even more important as because each platform is a standalone and it's not connected to any other regulated actors. So even if the regulatory measures target a limited number of platforms, it is key to involve all this large ecosystem around them to learn from their hands-on experience, to get their view on the application of specific rules, etc. Maybe a last point on data in the regulation framework. So yes, as a head of the data-driven regulation unit at Arcep, I could not have highlighted this slide point, of course. To be clear about what data-driven regulation is, I don't talk about regulating the data of the platform. I really talk about using data to better regulate. And when you have the power to request information, you gain experience and reduce, again, this asymmetry gap in information. You can come to it later, but there is maybe two phases. The one when you ask first the first question, you always get wrong because you don't know how to ask this question. And then you learn how to get better information. And in the end, you will learn from the collected data. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Pierre. We definitely will come to some of those issues you touched upon later. Thank you. And I mean, personally, as a bit of a linguistics fan, I think fascinating to see as well, because it tells you something about the mindset on oversight, that French has two different words for that. So great to hear that too. Thank you very much. Marisa, let's come to you. I mean, Facebook has certainly outlined its vision for the future of regulation, and we know also from previous discussions with you that you've thought beyond the enforcement part of the piece as well, in terms of how regulators can build a more cooperative relationship with platforms along the continuum of oversight. So what were your views on our paper? Looking forward to hearing these. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lara, and thank you to the authors of this really rich paper, and also delighted to be a panelist among so many experienced regulators, because at the end of the day, this is really part of this, right? Is how platforms and regulators can sit together and debate issues and get to the heart of the problems that then regulators can feel empowered to enforce. So the first thing I want to say is that I think that there are many things that are great in this paper from my perspective, and new as well, and I think that they need to be repeated. So the first one is something that was presented as well, where one of the premises of the paper is that the lack of oversight will discredit public intervention, and that is fundamental, because it's not only about that, but if public intervention is discredited, trust is not reached either. And this is fundamental in a world or in a discussion about providing oversight over rules that basically are trying to increase the trust on platforms, trust in the digital world, trust on governments, and trust on the regulators. So I think that this is a very, very important point. I think that the second one, which is related to the first one, is that clear thought through oversight can discredit some pieces of legislation. I think that when we talk about oversight and we talk about content, I agree that they're two different things, but that the oversight and the quality of the oversight sometimes is related to the quality of the rules that you're trying to oversee. So they are different things, in my view, I agree, but they are clearly interconnected, at least in practice. For us at Facebook, when we look, for instance, at content regulation overall, we think that accountability of the company is one element, transparency is another one, and oversight is the third pillar. So we can't deal one without the other. So oversight is not something that we can discuss in a vacuum. But of course, we can talk about principles of oversight. I agree with the fact that because oversight is in the hands of the regulator, it is very easy to go or link the conversation is very easy to go towards enforcement rather than through a broader culture of oversight. And I think it is a much more difficult thing to do. And therefore, I think that the idea of the ecosystem of oversight is very good because it allows for a good culture of oversight where everyone participates. I also agree with the fact, I didn't know about réglementation, régulation. It's an excellent point. I usually, when I discuss with my colleagues, also my American colleagues as well, they tend to use the word regulation a lot for legislation, because the way that the lawmaking, as we know, works in different parts of the world is different. But here in Europe, there is a big difference between legislation and regulation, and therefore the powers of the regulator should not only be and what they can do, and the enablers of a regulator, in my view, should not only be in the law, but also we should spend more time into what are the tools that those regulators need in order to do their job. So I think that is very important, because sometimes when we talk about oversight, we tend to only focus on the substance that they need to check, but not on the tools and processes that are at their disposal. One of the things from my experience in the past is that in the relationship with regulators, there is a mismatch between those who believe that the main role of a regulator should be on the enforcement side, again, and those who believe that there has to be an advisory role. And there isn't really a common understanding, or at least in certain parts of law, of what that should actually look like. Is it both? And I think it should be both, because that would help develop a law that, to your point, some of you have mentioned, is in an innovative area like the digital world, obviously needs to be in somehow principle-based and needs to be developed by doing. So we're all developing, and we're all developing by doing, both of the platforms subject to the law and the regulators who provide the guidance and also that enforce it when need be. Finally, I think that we might talk about privacy by design. We have that in the law already, consumer by design, safety by design. I would just caution here that it is important not to lose sight of what that tag means. We've seen it in the past that we start talking with tags, we lose the meaning. We try to simplify because obviously no one wants complexity. And I think that we should not at this stage label yet, but have a clear objective. And I think that in that sense, bringing more innovation, innovative ideas, innovative smart regulation doesn't mean no regulation. I think that this is really, really important. And in fact, that's one of the experiences and the learnings that we've had working with sandboxes, especially on privacy, is that this is not about no regulation. This is not about no oversight. This is about doing things a bit differently in collaboration with the regulator. And there is a lot of space for these new techniques and new ways to work with the regulators. So just to congratulate the team, very thought-provoking. Obviously cannot always agree on everything. That would be strange. But I think that it is an excellent start, and very much needed report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisa, for your feedback and wise views, and your comments on the by design trend and also your comments on tools that regulators need to do their job. This is something that's also come up in some of our DMA webinars, like the sort of rules and tools tension. Thank you very much. Thibault, let's come to you now. Welcome. As trailed already, you've published some very interesting work on computational antitrust that you're working on and how AI can help with enforcement. We'll delve into that more specifically later in this discussion. Meanwhile, any views you have to share on the paper at large would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. I concur with the idea that everyone should read the paper. And I think now, not so surprisingly, as everybody on the panel, I think it's a great paper. I also have to say it's quite a short paper, and to manage to fit so many ideas which are well shaped in so few pages, not following the American format, I think is a real tour de force. So for that, congratulations. I agree with everything or almost everything that has been said. So I only have a few points that I would like to highlight, and namely 5 of them. The first, it's the general idea of the paper. I very much agree with the idea that to create or to keep on building a tension between the East Coast and the West Coast code, so the Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., or the same applies in Europe, is not working. I think if we want to increase the common good, we could do it a bit differently. What's happening right now in Australia versus Facebook, I think, is a good example of the fact that everybody is a loser if we keep on doing that. And fully, again, I mean, it means changing the culture to some degree. The tension between the law, such as the one voted in the parliament, and the one in the Silicon Valley, or the one which is coming from the technology, has been existed for thousands of years. So it won't be easy to create sort of cooperation between the two, but I think it's possible. And to what Alexandre say, again, I agree with the fact that this is something that we see a little bit in the DSA, and something which, in my view, we do not see in the GMA, where there is a strong confrontation between the tech companies and the regulator. So if we can move the two a bit in the direction of the DSA, I think we'll be better off. So this is the first point that I wanted to raise, which is, again, the framework of the paper. Then the second point relates to the idea of providing guidance to platforms. And that, I think, it's a novel idea, an interesting idea, and of course immediately triggers the issue of cost and what's, you know, are we ready to engage cost in doing that? And in turn, it's a different question, but it's a subsequent question: are we ready to raise the budget of the European Commission and other regulators? We know from the OECD that 90% of the cartel cases before the European Commission are coming from reactive methods, namely a company applying for leniency, and the European Commission doesn't have the power yet to be proactive on the market. So I think it is necessary, and I agree it's a good idea to create a dialogue, but it means we need to discuss money eventually. Otherwise, this is something that we miss. But again, it's not, again, this is more the institutional part, which is probably a different paper. My third point relates to the idea of the independence, because obviously if you discuss creating a dialogue between the tech companies and the regulator, I think it should trigger immediately the issue of regulatory capture or the capture of regulators. This is something that the European Commission, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't been mentioning in official documents for the last 20 years. And yet I think it could be an issue. And what I want to say is that it could be that the regulator is captured by private companies, but also it could be captured by public interests. And to some degree, I think what we see is that the tech companies are doing a little bit of what the regulator used to do. They create a strong constraint on our society. And if tech companies compete with regulators to some degree, we may understand how we may see public regulatory capture, and that triggers, again, some institutional design and rework probably of those institutions. The fourth point is the one of the objective. Why are we creating a dialogue? And this, I think, is crucial. In my view, the DMA is very static. It takes into consideration only direct competition, does not really consider indirect entries on the market and so on. And so, but again, this is a personal view, but if we are working for giving more data to regulator, I think it should be for the regulators to become more dynamic and to grasp the real world a bit better, and again, without trying to escape the complexity of what's happening. But the objective, I think, should be discussed eventually. And the fifth and final point, and again, it's interesting to see that all of us pretty much have been discussing this one, but the idea of regulatory by design or compliance by design, I think it's fascinating. What I simply want to say here again, showing that it might be a bit more complex than just translating the law into code, is that there are different ways for us to achieve that. The first could be to properly translate the law into code, which could be done in the field of antitrust. If you take predatory pricing, this could be done by computer, the same analysis, but sometimes it's impossible for a computer to do that. The second way could be to reach the same objective. So you here design the digital architecture in a way that will lead people to use it in a way which is compliant with the law. And the third and final way is to create a way for regulators to enter the code when necessary, with the code coming from the capital and the parliament. And that is something that we could do. We could use technology to raise red flags when necessary for the regulator to then apply the law such as we know it. And again, I think it's a subject that we'll be discussing. So again, please everyone read the paper, and thank you very much for organizing this workshop.
Thank you, and thank you for promoting our paper as well. I mean, I certainly agree that it's a thorough read. You mentioned money, which I suppose is also a tool that regulators might need to do their job eventually. So, so definitely some food for thought there. We have a question from a viewer, and Alexandre, maybe I'll put it to you first. It's from Verena. Could you expand on the idea of the empowerment of users? What exemplary tools of instruments could be used for this? And are there examples of empowerment in place?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to all for your comment, which are very useful for us, because as Lara said, we will expand the project, and we really hope to continue this discussion with all of you. So on the question, it's a very interesting question, and indeed, I mean, because this empowerment of consumers, this is something that everybody talk about, but still, I mean, still the people don't feel very empowered. And if you see what the people say, or they want to take back control of everything, also clearly it's a proof that they feel disempowered. So, you know, more you speak about empowerment, less the people seems to be empowered. Now, we have mentioned two interesting examples of how you can empower them better, and maybe Pierre also they did interesting work at Arcep on that. But one is something that has been developed by the European University Institute and others, and we present that at CERRE some months ago. This is called Claudette. This is a very interesting algorithm where you can put your term and condition, and it will test them and see whether they are against EU law, in which case they will be made red, or whether there is a question mark, in which case they will be orange, or whether they are right. Okay, so that's a very interesting tool. So it's called Claudette, and you can watch it on the web and on the video of CERRE. We had a presentation of that some months ago. Another thing which is more recent, which has been done by the French authority. The French authority have set up this new pool of AI specialists which can help all the French authority, which is called Pérenne, and they have developed an interesting tool to to track every change, again based on AI, to track every change of term and conditions. So I think you see those new initiatives which are emerging. Now, as I have the mic in a way, I wanted to react on several things that have been said very quickly. The first on the question of Johanna, how we can do that, because it's such a culture change we are calling for, how we can do that, and that's a real question. But I was thinking that if the states do not change, the change will be disrupted. And what happened with this old business, which have been completely disrupted by those new platforms, may very well happen with the state. As we know, if we have a long term of the history, I mean, the state as we know now have been born at a specific period of time, and they are not at all permanent, perenne. So I think really that the state should be prepared, because otherwise the state will will be disrupted. And maybe 3 comments on Thibault. The first is, you said West Coast, East Coast, we have the same in Europe. Unfortunately, we don't. We have an East Coast, but we don't have a West Coast. So I think that's an issue for Europe. But also you mentioned the risk of capture. And one thing which is important to me, because you point to that, and I think it's very important, we know and we talk about capture by, the firm, but there is another capture that we sometimes talk less, and I see more and more, is, if I may be blunt, capture by loser, in the sense that disruption always creates loser. And there is this interesting book of some years ago, which is called How to Deal with Losers, so the one who lose because of the change. And sometimes, those, and I don't like to condemn loser, but that's economically what they are, they try to block the innovation, and so I think we have to be extremely careful about that. And I sense more and more in Europe that we have that kind of capture, which in a way worries me a bit. And a last point is on your different way to translate the legislative code into the computer code. I was thinking that in fact, we can look at European law. Your first method is regulation. Your second method is directive. And so this kind of different methods, we have it in EU law. In this sense. But thank you very much for all your comments. We need to improve the paper, Michèle. No, all of that.
Thank you, Alex. Perhaps some of the other among you might want to react to this question. Marisa, yes, please. What I think I'll do, if that's all right, is introduce the next round, and within that you can respond to this question too, because I will come to you first. Time is flying, but this is obviously such a rich discussion. So I think, as they described in their presentation, Michèle and Alex's paper centers around 2 main ideas, and it's very important we get all the panelists' views on these specifically, because what we're really looking to learn about in more depth today is what we can already appreciate might have worked as opposed to what hasn't. So learning by doing and by concrete examples that you might have to offer already on how regulators can improve their work in future. So the 2 main ideas in the paper as described are firstly on regulators, as Michèle put it, as a chef d'orchestre or conductors for the end user and business user, how they can gain inspiration from platforms, and secondly, the use of AI or data-driven approaches. So maybe Marisa, as our industry representative, we know you'll have experience to share here, and clearly you have views on empowerment too. So let's start with you.
Thank you. So I think that so the first comment I'd like to make here is that we should, when we look at oversight, the role of the regulator, the platforms and the users, we shouldn't think that all of these actors come around the table with an orchestrator in a vacuum. Like there's nothing done, right? It's not that we have to build everything. There's things that are already happening. So for example, when it comes to platforms, as a result of dialogue with the platforms, many dialogues with the regulators, many meetings, many encounters, many workshops, companies like ours have not only Facebook, but in the case of Facebook, we've come up with fundamental changes in the way that we audit ourselves, in the way that we show accountability, which I do think is part of that ecosystem of oversight on the side of the platforms, is how do we make ourselves accountable? And in that sense, the work and the journey that many of the digital companies have gone from very little transparency to very clear structured transparency reports that then are provided publicly and also to the regulators is an example of that. And perhaps one might say, well, they're not enough, they're not granular enough. That might be true. But that is a different question. But the fact that we've come from a pure concept of transparency from a very theoretical way into something very practical that then can be shared and then debated on, and measures can be taken on the basis of that, I think is an example. The second point, as a result of that guidance and dialogue with the regulator, is the fact that a company like ours is working on auditing its own content standards and how we apply those content standards internally These things happen internally and externally. So again, a fundamental point of connection later on with a regulator. I think that it's relevant to note that when we talk about oversight and regulator, it's not only about the regulator coming to investigate into into the company. It could be, but it's not only about that. It's about how does the regulator get the information that they need and the information that is relevant to what their task is. And again, nothing here is perfect yet, but it's just to say those tools do not need. So what I'm trying to say is the regulator in doing oversight does not need to come and start from zero. There are many things that are happening there. We've also, I think that in this chapter of content regulation, we have also tried to be somehow innovative in trying to, before defining code for us, because as we say, we've been talking code as in something external. So someone, some legislator, some body decides what that code should be. We as companies also have our own code, but also in this sense as well, from our community standards to the way in which we relate to our users. So in that sense, not to get too deviated from the question, in that sense, we created an experiment somehow in France, whereby based fundamentally in being open with each other and allowing the regulator to look into our practices, to ask questions, to give us some guidance, and together come up with some principles that then obviously were out of our hands, and then they were developed into proposals, and again, that is part of the policymaking process, and that's, we have nothing to do with that, only that all we can offer is our experience. And to be honest, there has been a lot of this, not in the same way or fashion like we've done in France, but in other countries or with other regulators as well, which with the fundamental principle of opening ourselves to how we do things and why we do things the way we do, what are the gaps we encounter, so that they can learn what they're trying to oversee, and we can learn also from the main challenges and concerns of those regulators. And it's happening now with media regulators. It's happened before with content regulators, with certain data protection regulators, probably less in Europe, more in Singapore, for instance, where we have worked with some sandbox initiatives, both on AI and privacy. So, but just to say, there isn't one answer, and there's not only one thing to try, there's many. And again, just to wrap up, it's not that the regulator it's the responsibility to do things. It is also depending on the level of accountability of the company. So more accountability, better prepared regulator, and a culture of oversight, I would say. And also, just on the brief and the question before about regulation directive, I think that we are entering into a wave where codes of conduct can also be part of that code too. It's code, and in fact, I just came from a discussion about the code of conduct on disinformation, which also has a series of issues and a lot of, and could be as an example of how we can do things better with the regulator moving forward. But it's not only about directives and regulation, in my view.
Thank you very much, Marisa. Johanna, let's come to you.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, I like the picture of the orchestra and the orchestration and the conducting by the regulator very much, because to me, it means that you have all sorts of different instruments or instrument groups that are cooperating together to produce one good piece. So that image that Michèle and Alexandre have chosen really fits very well the idea of how regulation could work. And I have to say that having been around for a long time, we've come quite a good way already. Top-down regulation is certainly not something that we would now like to execute anymore. We at the BLM and a lot of my colleagues within EPRA consider themselves more as partners to the industry on the one side and partners to the audiences, the consumers, the citizens on the others, because what we've come to understand is that it's always two sides of the same coin, regulation and consumer empowerment, and you would need a third side of the coin, of course, to tie in the industry. But this is a process that has evolved over the years. And it was interesting to listen to Michèle and Alexandre. The terminology, of course, is also changing. We're talking now not about regulating, we're talking about fostering, encouraging, empowering, we're talking about enabling, and we're talking about benevolence. And I think this is a very, very good way to drive this forward. Coming back to the image of the orchestra, of course, you will have mistunes occasionally if either you miss the start or you're too loud or too or not piano enough. And it is trial and error. And the conductor doesn't necessarily have to be able to play every single instrument in a piece. But if he knows the partitur, it's called in German, I lack the English, apologies. But if he knows the piece overall and everybody tunes in to produce something good together, then that is a very good objective to pursue. I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I am a little skeptical to come to the reality of the distribution of powers, again, on how quickly this objective can be achieved, because somebody touched upon, will the EU be empowered to do more in the question of competition regulation? I think it was Thibault. And there we come to a point that is one that I would love on some other occasion to learn more about, and that is competence and cooperation, which Michèle and Alexandre have left out of the paper, because that would have probably have been too much to do. But that is, of course, is an aspect that one would also have to think into the entire equation. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Johanna. Indeed, I mean, as we mentioned, for us, this is really kickstarting a more ongoing work stream. So we'd love to come back to competence and cooperation another time. We could talk in musical analogies all day. As far as I'm concerned, I find that really interesting. And with that in mind, that there was a question actually anonymously from a viewer asking who would be the first violin and the right hand of the director in an orchestra, because the director cannot work alone. It takes two to tango at a minimum. So, but moving on, and I think it may be that we move away from music and more onto AI and data-driven approaches, given that we're yet to hear from Thibault and Pierre on this. So Thibault, how about you?
Sure. Yeah, it's going to be hard not to go back to the analogy with music now. I want to do that. But anyway, going back more to AI and data. So as Alexandre mentioned, we've been indeed starting a project at Stanford University on what we call computational antitrust. The idea is very simple. It's to use computational tools, which are basically tools by which you can use a computer to solve problems for the purpose of improving or at least assisting competition agencies and companies. So to be very concrete, there are 52 agencies in the project now and over 35 academics, and our goal is to publish one article every month. There is one coming next week. So moving onto the substance, we see, of course, some big challenges. And I think it will be a mistake to think that if you can use the right tools and have the right data, then that's all you need and computers can take care of themselves. One of the challenge is first to decide on the fields that we can compute. Sometimes, as I said before, it might be easy, but some other times when it comes, especially in the field of competition law, to non-prices practices, it is very much a matter of balancing and understanding the market. And for a computer, it may be hard to do that. The second challenge is the one of developing the right tools. that I think we can solve. It's a technical challenge. It will get a technical solution. I'm not too worried, especially if computer scientists and lawyers start working together, which is something that we see now within agencies, which I think is excellent. Then, of course, there is an issue of how to get the data, because you need the data to feed the tools. And that will trigger some very interesting questions when it comes to cooperation between agencies. Maybe not all the agencies need to develop the tools themselves. They could probably cooperate there, but of course the issue of implementation will be a big one. And there is also a big challenge when it comes to defining the roles of those tools. I think it will be a mistake to think that we should only take into consideration what can be computed and that the rest is not important. That's a mistake that we've done in the field of competition law. With the Chicago School, we've been obsessed with prices and the rest was regarded as being useless. And I think we should not recreate the same mistake. When it comes to the potential, however, and I think this is, in my view, the balance is in the favor of the potential rather than the risk. We could use those tools to improve the procedures. If you've been practicing competition law, you know that we can do a lot in the field of merger control to speed up the process a bit. We could use blockchain to ensure the integrity of the data being transmitted by companies to agencies and vice versa. So that's one. We could use some of those tools to detect practices. If I want to be very concrete, you could use machine learning to detect when certain practices are coming together. This is the subject of the paper that we are going to publish next week. You could also use natural language processing to put millions of documents and try to understand what's the rationale behind the document. And that will be helpful. We know from empirical work that agencies, they detect very few anti-competitive practices, especially when it comes to abuses of dominant position. So I think here those tools could help. They could also help when it comes to analyzing the practices. And we already have a few examples. The European Commission said that in the Google Shopping case, they had to analyze almost 2 billion search queries. And the UK, we were discussing the power right to investigate the companies. That's one. But then comes the technological issues. And we know that the UK Competition Agency, the CMA, had 1 week to analyze 4 billion search queries. So here, obviously, you need to have the right tools. And then, of course, you could question yourself, what's the future? We've been discussing the issue of creating cooperation between companies and agencies. And, you know, why not developing some APIs that the agencies could give to companies so they could improve their compliance? And for the rest, of course, I mean, it's a big question mark. And again, I mean, if you are interested in those issues, please be in touch. Again, read the paper that CERRE is putting out, and you could visit computationalantitrust.com and see our publication, which in the field, which to me is really fascinating. And again, I'm very happy to see that we agree on the need to cooperate between lawyers, economists, computer scientists, data scientists. That's the first step. And it seems that we are there. So this is very exciting.
Multidisciplinary cooperation is definitely what we'd need to achieve a successful ecosystem of oversight, for sure. Time is absolutely flying. I think it's very important we hear from Pierre on the two main ideas in the paper, and in particular around data-driven regulation and oversight. So Pierre, let's go straight over to you, and then if that's all right, we'll conclude with everyone giving their top line ideas on the future of oversight.
Yeah, so I tried to be quick. So going to data approaches, maybe two things. The first one about the Facebook mission that Marisa Jimenez highlighted. I was part of the group of 10 digital experts from the different agencies that did this experiment with Facebook in 2019. Well, the goal was to explore a general framework of for regulation of social networks. So the first thing that we did, and this comes to the first point of the whole ecosystem in which the platform is living, is that the first thing we did is not only to talk to Facebook, but to talk with all the other stakeholders. So, and here, to be honest, we learned as much from Facebook than from the other players. So Google, Snap, Twitter, civil society, and also small companies specialized in content moderation. So this point also highlight the importance of the dialogue on these issues. Coming back to data and AI, what the mission and what we learned from Facebook is that they did indeed a great effort in self-regulation, such as Marisa also was saying. We saw this accountability layer and this transparency effort that Facebook was doing, and our role was to try to write the rule books of oversight of these two first layers. What we saw is that it demonstrated that platform may be also part of the solution of the problem we observed. So for example, in various cases, they have come up with agile solutions or removal of content by AI or less exposure for specific content with algorithm. But at the same time, self-regulation is still evolving. It's always evolving. It remains too reactive, we think, because it's often in reactance of some events, and it lacks credibility due to the extreme asymmetry of information between regulators and regulated, and which gives a sense of storytelling which nourishes suspicion about the reality of the platform action. That's why we think that this third layer of oversight proposed with a framework where the public intervention come to give more credibility to these first layers is very interesting, and this framework is obviously based on data, and we could call it like compliance by design, and it's what we propose in the conclusion of our mission, and it's also present in the paper. Coming up to data-driven regulation, yeah, at Arcep, it's a framework that we designed since like 2015, and in a nutshell, it is about relying more and more on the collection, utilization, and publication of data to amplify the ability of regulator to act. So this comes the question of empowering and more empowering users that was dealt by Alexandre before. What we did, maybe the main example, and I will stay here because of the time, is on mobile coverage. We ran a project to oblige operator to enrich their theoretical coverage maps. So the telco operator had to unbundle their data and share it with the regulator. That was pretty new in 2017. And it resulted in an online map where we can see coverage and quality of service in France called Mon Réseau Mobile, so my mobile network. So by doing this map, we acknowledge that even though like 95 or 96% of the population was theoretically covered, the reality were different between the regions. So some departments in France were covered only by 60% and other by 100%. And in the end, this unique data point that we have for national reality was different if we go into more details. So here we try to empower the different users and also the local authorities to have dialogue with us through this data. We were at hand for them. And maybe to come back on just one point on the also dialogue, we put in place a complaint desk, which is called J'alerte l'Arcep, where people or business also can complain about the problems they encounter with their internet service provider. So it helps us understand better the market, and it also helps us regulate better with more information that we could not have by other means. Maybe this could be an idea to help lowering the barriers for businesses to alert about specific problem in the DMA, and it could be also done at a national level where the dialogue is maybe easier than a European level for small business companies.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And I think it was important we took the time to really get the concrete examples because that's one of the big aims of today's session. Thank you also for bringing in the local authorities perspective, which is something, I mean, I know, Johanna, you've been talking more about the state versus the federal as well. So good to bring in all those different layers. We are unbelievably short of time, which is really a sign of what an important topic this is. And I did really want to try and get your views on what the future of oversight looks like. I think if we are to do that, it's going to literally have to be one-liners. So why don't I do that? Literally your 30-second pitch, maybe the 2 key buzzwords on what the future of oversight looks like for you. Thibault, let's start with you.
Sure, 20-second I could do. I think if we keep on creating the condition for a cooperation between the West Coast and the East Coast Code, we have rational reasons to be optimist. So the future is bright. So thank you very much for making me feel so optimistic today.
Great, thank you. Pierre?
Yeah, I'll be short too. So on one very interesting point is that it's easier to adopt new law than changing culture. But here, what I think is that definitely we need a change in culture, and it needs also political support and appropriate financial and human resources behind that to be able to process all this data. And finally, regarding the different knowledge that we can see in the paper and that are in the state members, there is some hope because we can see that change is coming. So this gives me hope, and thank you very much for the paper and all these examples.
Thank you so much. Marisa?
Yes, just very quickly, I think that there's no future in digital without trust. And there is no trust without a solid culture of oversight with the elements that we have spoken about today.
Great, thank you for introducing that element of trust here as well at this stage, very important. Johanna?
Keep the dialogue going. You're on a very good way, and spread the word so that we can wake up people to review their mindset and adopt a different culture. And that would be the route to achieve the oversight that we all need and want.
Perfect, thank you. Alex?
Yes, you will probably remember this quote which was made at the verge of a disruption in the south of Italy. Huh? Everything has to change so that nothing changes. And I really think that if the regulator don't change their way of working, they will lose their relevance and therefore the trust.
Thank you, Alex. And Michèle?
I don't think it's entirely the fault of regulators. I think the time is right now to get the law right, actually, and to get the DSA, DMA at least right, and to have as many principles on oversight included there, including on independence, and that way if something does go wrong at national level, there'll be a recourse at EU level.
Thank you. Really, thanks again. This has been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking session. Thanks always to the CERRE team for making it happen. I think as CERRE and the whole CERRE community and those of you among our speakers, we have a lot to go away with, think about and continue our work on. Right. CERRE has been thinking about oversight in broader terms. Next week, we'll zoom back in on the enforcement aspects of the DMA. That's our next event, Thursday, the 4th of March, again at 4 p.m. CET. Professor Giorgio Monti will represent the CERRE academic team there. We also have more events, AI on the 18th of March, DSA on the 29th of March, all topics that have come up regularly in today's conversation. Once again, thank you again. Thank you to speakers for joining us today. Thoroughly rich and enjoyable, thought-provoking discussion, and have a good evening until the next time. Thank you.